Listen closely. That silence, that's 60,000 people realizing she's not supposed to be here. It was supposed to be Jago night. His triumphant return, his kingdom, his adoring subjects. CM Punk, the prodigal son, stood in the center of the ring, a microphone in hand, soaking in the thunderous applause. He was a man reborn, a ghost who had walked out of the wilderness and back into the heart of the machine he had once railed against. For months, he had been the talk of the wrestling world, his every word a headline, his every move a seismic event. Tonight was the culmination, the grand celebration. He was home. But then, the carefully constructed symphony of his return hit a discordant note. A familiar, yet unwelcome, theme song echoed through the arena. Becky Lynch, the man, another titan of the industry, a woman who had clawed her way to the top with grit and a sharp tongue, emerged from the back. The crowd, momentarily confused, roared their approval. A confrontation between two of the biggest stars in the world. This was what they had paid for. They traded barbs, their words like daggers, each one aimed with surgical precision. It was a masterclass in verbal warfare, a chess match of egos and insults. Punk, the self-proclaimed best in the world, against Lynch, the woman who would redefine what it meant to be a champion. The air crackled with tension, the audience hanging on Giovim every word. It was a drama playing out in real time, a story of power, respect, and the never-ending battle for the spotlight. But as Lynch delivered her final, cutting remark, a new sound pierced the air. A sound that didn't belong. A sound that sent a ripple of confusion through the 60,000-strong crowd. It was a high-pitched, almost childlike melody, a stark contrast to the aggressive anthems that usually preceded a wrestler's entrance. For a moment, there was nothing, just the music and the sea of confused faces. And then, the Titantron flickered to life. The image it displayed sent a shockwave of disbelief through the arena. A name, a face, that hadn't been seen in a WWE ring for over a decade. The name on the screen was AJ Lee. And for a fleeting moment, the entire arena fell silent. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was a stunned silence. A collective gasp of disbelief that sucked the air out of the building. 60,000 people, a roaring sea of humanity just moments before, were now frozen in a state of suspended animation. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear the frantic whispers of the commentators, their professional composure shattered. You could hear the single, sharp intake of breath from Becky Lynch, her bravado evaporating in an instant. Then the silence was shattered. Not by a roar, but by a slow, rising wave of noise that started in the front rows and spread like a wildfire. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated emotion. A sound of joy, of shock, of nostalgia. A sound of 60,000 people witnessing a miracle. AJ Lee, the crazy chick, the Black Widow, the geeky girl who became a giant slayer, was back. She walked out onto the ramp, not with the confident swagger of a returning hero, but with a hesitant, almost fragile gait. She was older, of course, but the years had been kind. The same wide, expressive eyes, the same mischievous smile, the same aura of unpredictability that had made her a star. The crowd was on its feet, their voices a deafening chorus of AJ, AJ. AJ, she was not just a returning wrestler. She was a memory, a symbol of a different time, a ghost from a past that everyone thought was long buried. In the ring, CM Punk, her husband, stood frozen, a look of utter bewilderment on his face. This was not part of the plan. This was not in the script. His carefully orchestrated return, his moment in the sun, had just been hijacked by the one person he never expected to see in a WWE ring again. And as AJ Lee walked down the ramp, a single, determined look in her eyes, it was clear that this was not a social call. This was a reckoning. The cameras cut to black, but the story was just beginning. Backstage, the carefully controlled chaos of a live television broadcast had descended into a state of stunned silence. Producers were screaming into their headsets, writers were frantically rewriting the end of the show, and wrestlers, who had been watching on monitors, were now crowded around, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. The return of AJ Lee was not just a surprise to the fans. It was a surprise to everyone. The initial shock soon gave way to a wave of speculation. Why now? Why after all these years? Was she back for good? Or was this just a one-time appearance? The rumor mill, always churning in the world of professional wrestling, went into overdrive. Whispers of a secret deal, a last-minute change of plans, a power play by Guihami who had been clamoring for her return for years. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. The decision had been made in the utmost secrecy. Only a handful of people knew. Not even her husband, CM Punk, had been let in on the plan. It was a gamble, a high-stakes roll of the dice by a company that was desperate to create a moment, a real, organic, unforgettable moment in an era of manufactured entertainment. And it had worked. The return of AJ Lee was the talk of the sporting world. It was trending on every social media platform. It was leading every news bulletin. It was a viral moment that had transcended the niche world of professional wrestling and had become a global phenomenon. But the aftershocks of her return were felt most acutely in the locker room. For the current crop of female superstars, AJ Lee was a legend, a trailblazer, the woman who would kick down the doors and pave the way for them. But she was also a threat, a ghost from the past who had come to reclaim her throne. The auras of respect and admiration were now tinged with a hint of fear, of resentment. The battle for the spotlight had just gotten a lot more crowded. The ripples of AJ Lee's return spread far beyond the confines of the wrestling ring. The media, which had been so focused on the triumphant return of CM Punk, now had a new story to tell. A story of a woman who had walked away from the spotlight at the height of her fame, a woman who had chosen a quiet life over the roar of the crowd, a woman who had now, for reasons unknown, decided to step back into the fire. The pressure on AJ was immense. She was no longer the young, carefree spirit who had taken the wrestling world by storm. She was a woman in her late 30s, a wife, a writer, a mental health advocate. She had a legacy to protect, a reputation to uphold. The fans who had once adored her now had expectations that she wasn't sure she could meet. The world had changed in the 10 years she had been away. The women's division, which she had helped to build, was now a monster of its own creation, filled with world-class athletes who were bigger, stronger, and faster than she had ever been. The return also put a strain on her marriage. CM Punk, who had always been her biggest supporter, was now her rival for the spotlight. The man who had once been her rock was now a competitor, a fellow performer vying for the same precious minutes of television time. The lines between their personal and professional lives, which had always been so clearly drawn, were now blurred. The auras of love and support were now tinged with a hint of professional jealousy, of resentment. The most profound consequence of her return, however, was the one that nobody saw coming. The one that played out not in the wrestling ring, but in the quiet moments backstage, in the hushed conversations between father and daughter. Vince McMahon, the patriarch of the WWE, the man who had once been her boss, her mentor, her tormentor, was now a frail, old man, a shadow of his former self. And in his eyes, as he watched AJ Lee from the sidelines, there was a look of something that nobody had ever seen before, a look of regret. The weeks that followed AJ Lee's return were a whirlwind of chaos and excitement. She had formed an unlikely alliance with Becky Lynch, her husband's nemesis, and together they had declared war on the power couple of Seth Rollins and his wife, the Raw Women's Champion, Charlotte Flair. It was a storyline electricity, a clash of generations, a battle of egos that had the entire wrestling world on the edge of its seat. The ratings were through the roof, the merchandise was flying off the shelves, and for the first time in a long time, the WWE felt truly unpredictable. The story culminated at WrestleMania, the grandest stage of them all. A mixed tag team match, CM Punk and AJ Lee versus Seth Rollins and Charlotte Flair. It was a match that had everything: drama, athleticism, and a level of personal animosity that felt all too real. The four of them tore the house down, a symphony of violence and emotion that had the crowd on their feet from beginning to end. In the end, after a grueling, back-and-forth battle, it was AJ Lee who picked up the victory, forcing Charlotte Flair to tap out to her signature Black Widow submission hold. The crowd erupted. It was a storybook ending, a triumphant return capped off with a WrestleMania moment. But as AJ Lee stood in the center of the ring, her arm raised in victory, a strange thing happened. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just stood there, a look of profound sadness in her eyes. And then she did something that nobody expected. She took the microphone and, in a voice filled with a decade's worth of pain and regret, she told the world the real reason why she had returned. It wasn't for the money. It wasn't for the fame. It wasn't even for the love of the business. It was for her father, a man she had never known, a man who had abandoned her as a child, a man who, as it turned out, was a lifelong wrestling fan, and his dying wish, a wish he had expressed in a letter that had found its way to her after all these years, was to see his daughter, the girl he had abandoned, the girl who had become a superstar, wrestle one last time. The crowd fell silent once again. The boos and the cheers died down. And in that moment, in that arena, under the bright lights of WrestleMania, there was only a daughter, a father, and a story of redemption that was more real, more powerful, and more heartbreaking than any championship belt or wrestling match could ever be.